Welcome to What's My Thesis? I'm Javier Proenza, and today my guest is Ajani Brannum.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm just glad I got it right off the first try.
Yeah, a lot of people don't, so congrats to you.
Oh my God, the first few seasons of this, or first few episodes of this show, it took me a long time to figure out that I could just ask people,
Sure.
instead of like causing drama. Cool. So we know each other barely through Instagram. I get a sense that you do performance-based stuff sometimes.
Yeah, so performance is sort of like my home base, and that branches or more like snakes through a lot of different manifestations, but performance is like the main thing. Yeah.
Do you ever make objects?
You know, it's funny you mentioned that. This weekend, there's a show in David Horvitz's garden in Mid-City.
I think I saw the post. Yeah. What's it called?
So the show is called David Hammond's. It's based on a rumor / story regarding David Hammond's and that neighborhood. Apparently, allegedly, one person says he used to have a studio in that neighborhood way back in the 70s. And before he did the snowballs, that he's famous for, apparently he did a sale in Mid-City with styrofoam balls. But this is all apparently just like speculation or a story that someone told. So the show is responding to like rumor and all these things. So I have one piece in that show. It's called I Heard It Might Rain Today. It'll be very obvious which one it is. I don't know when this is airing, but when people see it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an object, which is also, I guess, a performance.
Okay, cool. Mm-hmm. Where did you grow up? Let's start there. Let's get the background. Yeah. Context matters so much in these conversations. I find, especially if someone volunteers what church they were raised in.
Oh, we'll get to church. Just wait. Talk about context.
Oh, okay.
So I was born in Anchorage, Alaska.
Holy shit. You're the only person I've ever met from Alaska.
Really?
Yeah. That was born there.
Oh yeah. It's funny. I've met a few artists here who are, if not from Anchorage, like other parts of Alaska.
Not that other places are boring, but I got really excited.
I mean, I love it. I've not been back, but I would love to go back now that I'm on the West Coast. But my dad was in the Air Force.
Okay.
So we were stationed in Alaska when I was born. I lived there for about 10 years. There was like a year in Florida. Then,
where in Florida? I'm from Florida.
Oh, Panama City.
Oh man, they used to have this water park that I wanted to go so bad.
I don't remember anything about it, but I remember it's supposed to be like the spring break capital of whatever.
Yeah.
So when I was 12, my family moved to South Carolina.
Okay.
A lot of my family is from there ancestrally anyway. My family is still there, but I moved to LA 10 years ago. For grad school, over 10 years ago for grad school. So I've been here since then.
Where'd you go?
UCLA.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So do you identify as third culture kid? Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm thinking about it because people ask me related questions sometimes. They'll ask me like, you're black, but I can tell you're mixed with something else.
Oh, no. I'm a third culture kid, but not with the Army, with the UN.
Oh,
that's why I asked.
I didn't realize third culture was like a military thing.
Third culture is anybody that grows up outside of their original culture, which I guess doesn't necessarily apply to you because you lived in America, but Alaska's fucking counts.
Yeah, I mean, so
you were an Army brat. Wait, what, Air Force did you say? Or?
Air Force, yeah.
Air Force, okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question because I do think, even despite the military context, like growing up in Alaska, like there's something about being in a place where you can walk outside, you see mountains everywhere. The indigenous population there is still very prominent. So you see a lot of symbology and craft related to like the other than human beings there. And then you'll walk and you see a moose and it's like, oh, that's the moose that's on the totem pole. That's like on the, so it feels culturally very specific, and coming to the lower 48 is like a different sort of experience.
I can only imagine. There's a whole country in between. Yeah. Did you watch Night Country?
No,
okay. I'm sure everybody's asking that. I felt lame asking you that, but yeah.
No, I have not watched it, but I heard it's good.
No, I mean, it's good. And they just rehired, I think her name is Isa something, I forget. She's a Mexican, but it's a really interesting perspective because, like in the show, there's a lot of stuff about the indigenous cultures there, but I think that there's like the spookiness, like I think there's a spookiness overlap between Mexican culture and, like a lot of that Catholic sort of like very morbid bent that like, that I grew up with.
Ooh, wait, I'm interested. Like, what do you mean?
Just like, relics of like relics are just literally bone fragments. It's all very morbid, kind of dark, like the undertones of Catholicism in particular. It's very pageantry, but then I think that something merged. I'm completely out of school. I'm Cuban. I'm not Mexican. So, sure. But, like over in I'll start by referencing like Santeria in Cuban culture is very much a offshoot of Catholicism, right? It's like the slaves, they kept practicing their not monotheistic. What is it?
So there's like a pantheon where I know we're going to talk about this some.
Okay.
So like the pantheon of like Orisha or deities that sort of got smuggled into like the saints and
like the San Lázaros and all of that.
Yeah.
And I think that gets pretty dark and morbid, but the Mexican stuff just has a different flavor that is like not, it's like you mix Catholicism with whatever indigenous people in Latin America, which is also probably not a fair way of describing them. Sure. But you see that and it's interesting how it like it cross-pollinates with different cultures, but I feel like there's more of an overlap between. I think that's why she did such a good good job writing the show, because there was a lot of empathy for the mystical elements of culture, and they never and it's never quite like hard and fast like we're in the realm of the spirits or we're in the realm of like hard science, which I really enjoyed. And so anyway, so I thought she was well suited for that. I can't wait for the next season because she's writing another one. Wow. I didn't realize like all this was like folded into the show. I might have to check it out. Oh, I highly recommend it. It's gangster, I would say. Okay. Like in the 90s terminology, like it's tough living, man. It's filmed in Reykjavik, but why didn't they just film it in Alaska? I'm sure there's more infrastructure, I would imagine, in Iceland. But anyway, so what was the experience like? Did that cultural element affect you? Well, I mean, you talk about night country. What's really interesting to me, and this is why I think about the Alaska experience I had, is like being so culturally specific, is a lot of the stuff that I do now really is interested in what some people might call spirit or spirituality, but maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. Yeah. I think because the indigenous presence is so prominent in Alaska, I think there is just something I learned about like an animal is not just an animal. Like it also plays a role in this ecosystem of which humans are just one part, Yeah. So very non-American. Well, not non-American, but I would say that a lot of Afro-diasporic cultures like still hold fast to that belief. Like one of the things about being from South Carolina, even though my family is like very Christian, there are still these little things that folks across the Black diaspora do that are just like acts of casual reverence for plants, animals, these things that are often counted as like non-human or like not having agency. So I'm really interested in that because it's like spirituality, but it's not woo necessarily. Yeah. No, totally. I mean, I just know the undercurrents of Cuban culture are so tied to that, like we have orishas and it was a little bit distant to me because I didn't grow up in Miami so much, but I remember walking into people's houses and just being like, oh, there's like an altar here, and like with offerings and stuff. So I can relate to that a little bit, So then where do you identify with most, like like in terms, do you feel like you're a South Carolinian? Like, what's home for you? Because I just can't imagine Alaska being, just because it's so cold. I would imagine.
I love it though. I mean, even though I haven't been back since I left.
I'm from Florida though.
Oh, I mean, it's so
I'm
funny.
from Miami.
It's so funny. Like when I came here, I remember like the first winter that happened.
Yeah.
And it's like, it gets like 50 or 60 degrees. After 1 year, I was like, I'm so cold. Oh my gosh. But home, I really don't think of home as like a single thing. Alaska's home, South Carolina's home, now LA is home. Like all of these things are home to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then you have there's a little place in your heart for each one.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Then when did you start, like, was it in Alaska that you started because performance is it's like a different animal than like deciding that you're into visual art, right? There's something there. I think that there's like I think of visual artists as people that are like, as someone once read the Freudian description of an artist, and it's like, wanting people to see your genius by like not looking at you, but like by what your work is. And I was like, fuck, man, Freud's got some kooky ideas, but that one's pretty on point. Does that resonate with the performance element? Because you're a lot more in the forefront, right? Like, whereas like I like to hang back and be like, oh yeah, those people are enjoying my stuff.
Yeah. Well, this I'm sure will also be a recurring topic. There are two sort of streams of influence when I think about like my performance history. The first one I have to shout out because I have a few teachers and peers who've like really emphasized the importance of like owning sort of like my cultural experience as a form of authority. Shout out to Ebony Janice as a person who talks about decolonizing authority. But the first performance context I sort of experienced was church.
Okay.
I grew up in Black churches, and
which denomination?
Non-denominational.
Non-denominational. Okay.
Yeah. And my parents, but especially my mom, were very involved in church. So I would go every week. I spent like 3 or 4 days out of every week at church.
Whoa, yeah. Okay.
So not only is there the thing about like congregation and service and all these things, but also like we're buying snacks and we're taking them to the building and we have to clean and we have to make copies and the copies go to the classrooms and the puppets go to the classrooms and like all this. So performance is sort of like church is sort of like my first performance home. And then the second one is concert dance. Okay. So
what's concert dance?
Well, so when I was 5, 6, I started taking ballet lessons. Okay. In a basement studio on the Air Force Base where my family lived. And I focused on ballet until I turned about 11 or 12. Then I started to learn about jazz dance and lyrical dance. I learned about modern dance in high school. And then when I got into college and later into grad school, I started doing more stuff with improvisation and somatics. So, a lot of my work has been interested in this like on stage versus off stage thing and like what the relationship between those things is. I'm actually, one recurring question for me is like, what can I use from my performance skill set that doesn't necessarily require me to be the center of attention or activity? That's like a recurring question for me.
And how does that manifest?
Well, I think the David Hammonds thing is like one example. Well, no, I won't talk about that.
So you mean in that particular instance, the fact that you're making an object?
Well, this is why I don't want to talk about that necessarily.
No worries.
There's a project that I recently presented at a festival in Austin, Outsider Fest, great festival, a couple weeks ago, which is a restaging of something I did here in March at Human Resources last March. Oh, okay. And you might call it a conventional performance. It's like 5 people, including myself, in front of an audience. But it wasn't a process where I said, okay, I'm coming up with all the steps and then I'm going to teach you the steps and we do them. I think that's what people often think about when it comes to conventional concert dance, right? There's a choreographer who's in charge and then people who sort of obey. I started, I guess, in a way that a lot of conceptualists might work, where I was like, I was invited to do this thing. I don't have money to pay people. So I know I want this performance to come together with as few resources as possible and in as little time as possible. So I consulted with a friend and a peer, Simone Reynolds, who is based in Chicago. They identify as an imagination doula. So I had a session with them where we did some divination, and they came up with some really great questions to sort of like support this process. And then from there, I developed a series of questions. I found a story to share with the group, and then also some anecdotes. And I sent all these things in a voice note to the cast. So we started with the voice note. They thought about the voice note. They sent in their answers. And then from there, I sort of like compiled a series of exercises that we learned together and practiced together. And then we just put all that together, and that was the performance. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't so much about how are we going to be present so much as what needs to happen in this context. And then from there, how do we bring that to an audience in order to do something on their behalf and also ours?
It sounds also like there's an ownership step back as well, where I would maybe say, like, just as an analogy, maybe it's not 100% accurate, but sort of how the cast of what's it called, the Larry David show?
Oh, Curb Your Enthusiasm.
So that, like, where they have like maybe necessary beats that they want to hit, but then there's like space for the performers to sort of make it their own and improvise. Yeah,
and even beyond that, I mean, I always wonder like how they keep it together on set, because but even beyond that, I wouldn't say there were specific beats so much as we know we're going to do these warm-up exercises, this performance exercise. We know we're going to tell this story, and then the audience is going to do A, B, and C. So it wasn't even landmarks in terms of like choreographic things so much as we know we're going to do these 5 things, and that's what we're getting ready to do.
Can I go back just a little bit? Because when you were first, you were going from church performance into the concert dance. Is that what it is? Okay. Yeah. So concert dance, was there a point, you're studying ballet, that seems rigorous to me, that was there a moment, were you like aiming to be a ballet dancer, or a specific like dance like within the confines of what we think of, like, toe shoes and kind of thing, like, bars and stuff like that? Was that the culture? And then if that was the case, what broke that and made you transition into visual arts?
Well, it's funny. I would say I don't think I've transitioned into visual art. I describe myself as a recovering concert dancer.
Okay. Visual art maybe not be but sure, I mean, in the capital A art world, is that more appropriate? Okay. Yeah,
I think that's fair. Which I have to say, like, the last episode you released with,
John Plipchuk?
No, Brianna Mims. Yeah. It's like it feels like a similar kind of journey, which is cool. Yeah. But for me, what's funny is, for a while I said, I think I can only imagine my practice in sort of negative space terms. It was never that I was like, and now I'm going to do X, but somehow I'm in these contexts and I never feel grounded or at home in them. So when I was in high school, I went to the South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts and Humanities. Great school.
The East Coast has such crazy naming conventions for schools.
I know. I mean, I love saying every name, every word in the title.
Yeah.
But I was there, the curriculum at that time was mostly ballet. And I was like, I'm okay at this, but I don't feel like ballet's what I'm going to do. And thank God I learned about modern dance, because I think I would have quit dance if I hadn't. Then when I got to college, I was like, okay, I'm good at this dance thing, but also, do I want to move to New York and try to become a professional dancer? Like, I have no idea how to support myself. So then I came here for grad school, and I was like, okay, I'm doing the dance thing here. And over time, as I worked with more and more choreographers professionally, I was like, okay, I know I'm good at this. And also there are all these other skills that I love using that I feel like I don't know how they fit into a dance container. Mm-hmm. So I think the thing for me has always been sort of like ending up in a container and then sort of like leaking out of the container to see where else these skills or these capacities can sort of like have a moment to do what they do.
So when you went to UCLA, mm-hmm. that was your graduate program?
Yeah.
Was it more of a dance program? It wasn't in the art department?
It was not in the art department.
Okay.
It was in the Department of World Arts and Cultures / dance.
Okay.
Which there's an MFA for folks who are doing choreographic practice. And then there's sort of like a MA PhD track for people who are doing cultural and performance studies. So I did the PhD. And here's, a great example.
So you're not an MFA. I'm sorry.
People
I should be calling you doctor.
Please, that's my father.
Wait, he's an Air Force. He's an Air Force doctor.
He's a doctor. He's a doctor in his heart and his mind. Everyone in my family is very learned in
and caring.
Yes, even if they don't have the titles, but. For me, I was like, if I'm going to do this dance studies thing, there's no way that I can't also have a practice because like I can't just like sit and write about dance without doing it. So throughout the 8 years that I was in school, I was also working with other people.
In other departments, not just strictly with the with the dance department.
Actually, yeah, a couple of times in other departments, but mostly people within the WAC-D program and then people like within LA. But all that's to say, while I was in grad school, I was like, okay, I'm doing dance, but I'm also writing about dance and I'm researching about dance. So it was this thing of like balancing these two things and seeing how they meld when they can.
I've never spoken to a doctor of dance. That's fucking awesome.
We're out here.
That's awesome.
We're out here and we're amazing.
I'm really like, your credentials are pretty impressive, man. So then, you said that there are parallels with Brianna. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you guys went to amazing schools. Yes. USC and UCLA are both probably top notch. Yeah. She works obviously a lot more in the abolition realm. Mm-hmm. What is the kind of concept? Because you mentioned conceptual conceits. Right. What is the conceptual space that you like to work in?
So the way I'm currently describing my practice is it's one that's interested in how we persist. Mm. And I like to keep it vague because persist, like that sounds great, but it could also be like, why is that still happening?
Yeah. Persistent cough, which is what I have been recovering from. Yeah.
So persistence, it's a very ambivalent sort of quality. Where that has led me is, obviously like an interest in dance and choreography, but we were talking about the spirituality stuff. I have to say, like during COVID, but right before COVID, but also especially during COVID, like a lot of people, I had a renewed interest in spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. And so I started studying with a few folks who I have a lot of respect for. One is Dana Lynn Knuckles. She goes by the People's Oracle on Instagram. Okay. She's the person who convinced me that I'm a Pisces instead of an Aries, which maybe we'll come back to.
Okay.
I also started studying with someone named Jade T. Perry, who is a wonderful interdisciplinary artist, educator, theorist, who's really interested in what she describes as Black folk metaphysics. Mm-hmm. And all of that work has a lot to do with how we're in the world and what things we practice in order to be in the world in life-giving ways, especially or specifically as Black people. So my investment in performance is like asking, how do we learn to inhabit these bodies and to what ends? So I would say spirituality is an interest, but again, it's not this sort of like grandiose, removed from everyday life kind of thing.
Yeah, and out here, spirituality carries a certain white girl connotation, which I'm sure is very distant from it. Yeah.
Yes.
A little bit more grounded in that diasporic element that you were describing. What's it called? Leslie Muse, I interviewed him. I don't know if you're familiar. He's more. He started off in film, and he's more in that in the art space of installation and whatnot. One of the things that he said that was very interesting, and two interesting things about this, because I posted his clip on TikTok, and Black people dragged him. You know,
what did he say? I want to know.
Well, he's a Black man, for the context.
Right.
But he was saying that. Communism, the basic forms of communism and things like that. This is a paraphrase. I'm sorry, Leslie, if I get it wrong, but those things are devoid of that diasporic. He used the term woo woo, and it doesn't necessarily work for that. And I'm also getting a piece from the abolition thing where what Brianna was saying is that it's experimentation.
Yeah.
So, and imagination, right? Like so I think both of them sort of talked about this idea that there is no way to necessarily quote unquote fix society. So there is a lot more spirituality and a lot more imagination required from that. And the pushback he got from people on Instagram or on TikTok was just people saying like, you know, the Angela Davis and all that. And I don't necessarily think that is a fair argument, because I don't know what her spiritual practice was, but I never got the sense that it was completely secular from her.
Well, I mean, I would agree with that. Like, I don't think that...
And I'm not that well versed in her. This is just a glance.
Yeah, I don't think that I'll go so far as to say, I don't think that any Black person who's had a sustained commitment to abolition or anti-oppressive work, there is no way that they've done this work without some significant spiritual grounding. I will say part of my ethos and part of the ethos that I see throughout the Black diaspora is like, people say like God can use anyone, you know, like if communism, anarchism, operating through legal routes like the NAACP did, like all of these things are opportunities, but I find that for Black folks especially, they're never the end goal of what this work is, in large part because a lot of these systems don't account for spiritual elements or spiritual practice. And I think a lot of the alienation that folks experience in this version of the world, yes, it's because of capitalism and how it operates. And we know that one of the first things that colonizers do when they go into a place is try to rob a people of their spiritual practices. Because that's how we understand what we are and what our bodies are and what relationship is. So I will say, even though there have been plenty of Black Marxists, Black communists, Black anarchists, Black whatever,
there's some being prosecuted right now by Joe Biden.
Yes, exactly. In the grand arc of things, when we talk about like a Black liberation history, spirituality is always a part of that, even if it's not overt. Yeah. Well, I mean, even if you look at somebody like the profoundness of somebody like what's his name? Oh my God, I'm blanking on the biggest Black Panther that got murdered by the FBI. Not Huey Newton.
No, you know more than I do. The Fred Hampton. Like even his, like there is a subtle subtext of like basically what he was trying to do was just organize all poor people, not just Black people, not just, you know, which is something that I think, you know, the labor movement really fucked up originally, you know, back in the day where it was very segregated, where it was very uninclusionary. So I think that it's interesting, like not to, I always feel I'm not a very God, I don't have a very strong relationship with God. So I always feel like I'm appropriating language when you know, but there is like, you know, there's a very distinct, like we're all God's children and we shouldn't be hating on each other. We're all in the same boat, which I think speaks to what you're saying, you know, that element of like, even if it's not overt, there is something very, I mean, like compare, I don't know if Fred Hampton was a Christian, but he was far more Christian than most people that purport to be, right? In terms of the dogma of caring for poor people and stuff like that. I don't want to pigeonhole him and say that he was Christian, but there is something to that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing about being all God's children, it's interesting because a lot of Black feminists say like, well, one of the reasons it's important for Black women and femmes to center themselves in their own activism is because like, if people like get on our page, they'll find like a lot of the stuff that we're doing for ourselves is going to make everyone's lives better. So I think when it comes to that kind of organizing, it's like, yes, we're all God's children. And also like we have a lot more knowledge and
we have a very specific perspective, I would say, you know, like, learned experience, life experience.
Yes. And what that we is, it shifts. But yes, I know like in the history of Black organizing, a lot of folks are just saying like, it's like, y'all are welcome, but it's mostly because like, we also see and know what's going on with you. So just like, we have a clue.
Yeah.
You know,
do you, with your spirituality, are you still a practicing non-denominational? And for people that don't know, non-denominational is a denomination. I found that out recently, like within the last few years. Yeah. Are you still active within that church? Okay.
No.
When did you start to branch off from that?
I think it's again like that's the container, and the leaking thing has always been happening. But I stopped going to church when I came to LA. So for the first year, I was really
like around 10 years. You've not been a lapsed non-denominational Christian.
Yeah, and I have to thank one of the people I was living with, sort of like in my second year here, because like I was like walking to their house to like catch the bus to go to church, and I was telling my roommate, oh, you know, I'm going to church, and she was like, you know, maybe you don't have to go to church. She didn't say that in those words, but she was like, yeah, maybe you don't have to go to church. And so I thank you, Alessandra Williams, for saying those words to me. Yeah.
And then where does the spirituality come from? Like what are the things that after breaking from that resonated with you? Are there any particular authors like Marianne Williamson? Joking.
I mean, I have not read her books, so I'm not going to shade her. But I mean, the people I mentioned, Dana Lynn Knuckles, J.T. Perry, they've been wonderful guides. So I would say I've learned a lot by learning more about hoodoo, which is a Black Southern folk metaphysical tradition. Mm-hmm. I've also learned by learning more about Afro-diasporic folklore. So stories and storytelling are huge to me. Mm-hmm. I have a tarot practice that I've had for a few years. I was reading for other people, but I put that on hold. And then I've also, like, I like to say that spirit to me is anything that gets invisibilized by these oppressive structures that we have in place. So for me, spirituality has just been like reading a book, mm-hmm. like learning how the world works and like being with people and seeing how things operate and asking like, what is not being said or like what is not being acknowledged in this moment, and how do we get to that and do something with that? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. I like the idea of, because it is sort of like a nourishment, right? That you're doing, especially when you're reading a book, mm-hmm. you know. Can you tell me a little bit more about just like, for example, can we talk about the object? I'm just curious. Great, yeah. Can we go back to that? Sure. Okay. So then how does this performance element transform into that object making? Because that is more not, we're not going to say like what is considered traditionally art, yeah. but it's more akin to my practice. Like, honestly, the dance stuff is fascinating to me, but I've just never felt that comfortable in my body.
Yeah.
you know, like that. I mean, not that I'm awkward or anything, I with athletics and stuff, but like to be fully expressive mm-hmm. with dance is, you know, salsa's not that expressive, you know, like the
you don't think so?
I mean, it is, but not like, you know, not like the kind of stuff that Brianna Mims does, right? Like that is very vulnerable. You're very exposed, right? Again, going back, like I'm that Freudian archetype of the artist. I'm like, I made the object. I'm the genius. You guys all like the object, as opposed to me being the personification of that thing. And then there is some level of being able to embody something that maybe don't always embody. All of those things are interesting to me. And then from that perspective, I'm curious how you go about object making. Does that make sense?
Yes. Can I tell a story?
Yeah. Oh, please. Podcasting is great.
It's not directly related to the object, but I think this story is a helpful way to start like answering this question. Yeah. So in this performance that I did in Austin, Trouble is the name of the piece. Is this good?
Yeah.
Okay. At the end of the piece, I tell this story. And I start by saying, because this is a queer performance festival, this wouldn't be a queer performance without a moment of self-disclosure. When I was 12, like I told you, my family moved to South Carolina. And very soon after moving to South Carolina, I was like, wow, like this is not the place for me. Like I could just feel on so many levels that like the fullness of my livingness was somehow not acceptable in this place. So
what part of South Carolina?
Columbia, the capital.
Okay.
Yeah. So while I was there in this sort of like teenage into like early teenage years state, I would spend a lot of time by myself. I would go out walking sort of like in the streets of our neighborhood, just sort of like looking up at the clouds and being like, oh my gosh, like I would love to be like a famous entertainer. I love to dance. I love to sing. I would love to learn to act. Triple threat, Henny. Like I would love to just like go around the world, seeing people and having new experiences because of my craft. So by day, I would go out and wander and sort of daydream about these things. And at night, I would pray for these things to happen when I wasn't trying to pray away the gay, which, didn't work.
Wait, so that was part of your cultural reality? Were your parents encouraging you to pray away the gay, or was this more just the...
It's the contextual imperative, which I think is important. Contextual imperatives, very important. So one day I was out walking and I heard something behind me. I turned around, nothing was there. So I took a few more steps. I heard something behind me again. I turned around, didn't see anything, but I was like, okay, this sounds like footsteps. So when I get to the end of the block, I'm going to turn around and go home. Third time I was walking, heard something behind me, and I whipped around and I saw this shriveled old man giving like fairy tale mischief makers vibes. And he was like, my child, it is I. And I said, who are you? I have no idea who you are. And this man said, my child, I have heard your wish. And I thought, I was like, are you telling me that you've been like hearing me like praying at night about like this entertainment stuff? Like bold of you to admit that you've been like stalking me and eavesdropping me, but like say more. And this old man says, I have come to grant your wish. I will allow you to be a famous entertainer who can travel and meet people and see these things and do these things. But in exchange, you must give me your soul. So I thought about this and I was like, I know things like this don't end well.
Yeah.
But
you could have been really good at guitar. This is the Crossroads story.
Could have been. But I was like, you know what? I'll make a deal with you. Let me experience life for like 20 years and then you can come back and I'll give you my soul. And he's like, my child, I will grant your wish. And he vanishes into thin air.
Nice.
So 20 years passes. Here I am, obviously, after 20 years, I've gotten to travel. I've gotten to do a lot of acting. I've done more singing, or not acting, sorry, dancing. I've done some singing. I would actually kind of like to do some acting.
Yeah.
And one night in particular, I got off stage after a performance. I was like really tired. I was like, okay, I know that I'm going to go out with some people, but I just want to like sit down for a little bit and rest before I decide what to do. And when I got off stage, I put on the pair of shoes that I had when I was on the road the day that I met the old man, because, you know, my feet haven't grown in 20 years.
Yeah.
I kept the shoes as a reminder of the journey that I had taken, right, to get to this point, right?
Those aren't 20 years old.
These are not the 20-year-old ones. No, unfortunately.
Those have come out in the last 2 decades, I think.
But, you know, I get off stage, I put on the shoes, I sit down, I take a rest. And as I take this rest, I start to feel this rumbling. It's sort of like deep in my guts, but then I realize it's coming from deep within the earth. And I sort of hear this like distant voice that says, my child. And so I'm like, okay, like something kind of familiar has returned to me. I don't really know what it is, but whatever. I take another breath. I feel this rumbling. It sort of intensifies and this voice gets closer. It says, my child, it is I. And I'm like, shit, it's the old man. He's come back to get my soul after 20 years. And, you know, I'm like, I have just reached a point in my practice where I feel like all of these pieces are gelling, and the connection between what I'm doing as an artist and what's happening in my life, like all of these things feel like they're in alignment. Like I've really started to find my soul and what it is. So I'm not ready to give it up just yet. Because I'm an improviser, I love a good prompt. So I say, I'm going to take a breath, I'll count to 3. And when I open my eyes, the first thing that I see is going to help me figure out the situation and get through it. So I take a breath, I count to 3. And then at the count of 3, bam, I open my eyes. The first thing I see is this pair of shoes. So it's like a reflex. So much so that by the 3rd time I hear this old man's voice, it is I have come to collect. I reach down to my left foot, tear off the bottom of the shoe, whip around and throw it in the old man's face, right? So then there's a pause and the old man reaches down, picks up the piece of rubber, waves it in my face and says, thank you for your soul, then vanishes into thin air.
That is the best monkey's paw I've ever heard.
I love telling that story. And I think there are many reasons that story is important or impactful to me. But the main one is we hear about these crossroads stories often, right? But I've been asking myself, especially in the past 5 years or so, with concert dance in particular, it's like, is there an easier way to do these things? Is there a more life-giving way to engage with performance that's not about like, oh my gosh, I'm in the studio, I'm sweating, I'm doing all these things? That can be great, but so often in my experience, there's been this thing of like, oh, we reached the last show and it's over. Now it's time for the post-show depression. And I always wonder, like, why does the infrastructure of that kind of performance, why does it take so much from people and not offer them something in return?
Yeah.
So I think we were talking about the object, actually. This is a great way to come back to that. For me, when I was invited by Susie Halajian from Joan and David Horvitz, I was like,
Joan Gallery is a nice space, by the way. I forgot that that's who was throwing it. But when I saw it, when you posted it, I was like, oh, okay. I respect Joan. Yeah.
They have some wonderful programming. So when I got that invitation, I was like, okay, like I immediately felt this part of myself that was like, oh my gosh, I don't make objects. What am I going to do? Who am I going to call? What's the blah, blah, blah. And it's like, what do you have?
Mm-hmm.
You have the email that gives you information about the show. And they keep mentioning like, well, we're expecting rain for this. So I was like, okay, I know that whatever I have to make, like it has to be water resistant.
Yeah.
So I had information. I knew that there was a garden. I went to visit the garden, blah, blah, blah. And after just like sitting with all of these pieces of contextual information, like it just sort of like came to me very stupidly. Like, what if there was a sign that said, I heard it might rain today? It feels like tearing off the shoe and like doing like that. And I love a sort of like stupidly simple gesture. That feel like in performance, like if I'm dancing, like something really feels like it's working. If it's just like, oh yeah, like it's happening. So for me, I think performance knowledge and performance awareness often leads me to these stupidly simple gestures. And I think those things are somehow testament to just like a grounded awareness of where you are.
Well, it's super fascinating because it turns out that your process is very similar to like to like mine, you know.
Oh yeah.
You I think that sometimes it just kind of happens. I think that's the point of a practice, right? Like of a art making practice. It's a space where you can work something out, right? It's fascinating. Like right now I'm working on these things that I hated for a very long time. And I was like, it breaks all these rules of form and function, right? Like I'm literally making something right in the middle of a page. And it was like, it all my training was like fighting against it. And then I'm like, and then the more I make of them is like, oh no, like it's an object. It's a drawing of an object that I couldn't make in real life because it's all this tricky perspective things. But it's funny when you have that resistance and then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, these are good. This is, like I've been fighting it because my perception of it has been wrong, right? Like I've been, or not necessarily wrong, but I'm not appreciating what's happening. I'm not present. Like you said, like I'm not taking the contextual clues. I am fighting what it is that it is, right?
Yes.
So anyway, sorry, that just reminded me specifically of that process where like now I'm just banging them out and I'm going to do them. Like I'm at like 6 that I'm working on. I'm just going to keep doing them until like, it's not there anymore, Yeah.
I mean, I think this piece about meeting the resistance is actually the core of the stuff that I've been doing recently. When I was having the meeting with Simone Reynolds, who I mentioned, one thing that they brought up, and I might have brought this into the session with them, but they were saying something about like, what about the parts of yourself that, maybe haven't been as present in your practice or something like that. But I ended up, thanks to their questions, coming up with a series of questions that I shared with the group, like I said. And the first one is, what parts of yourself have you neglected, ignored, or abandoned in order to maintain your creative practice? So a lot of what I do has been just about asking, like, why does it feel so hard to make things, whether that's a performance or an object or an essay or anything else? It's just like, there are so many resistances. And I mean, maybe I don't have to tell you, but so many of those resistances, I think we're taught that it's like, oh, well, it's like artist's block, or like you need more information. It's like, well, maybe, but a lot of those resistances are also structural. So by asking myself, like, okay, what's the thing that feels hard? Or like, what's the part of myself that like is somehow offering this resistance? By like centering that and like listening to it and trying to move with it, like that's how things start to flow. And so I've learned not to judge them, although, I still get frustrated. But, just by listening to them, it's like, oh, there's actually so much that's waiting to happen.
It's the way that you're talking about it is actually giving me kind of goosebumps, because you're talking about art practice in the sense that people talk about, like, like about feelings in therapy, right? Like, let's say that you're really mad about let's say I'm really mad at a woman, right? And then I realize it's because I have a crush on her, but until I sit down and analyze that resistance to that person, like, why do I find her so whatever? I mean, I'm not thinking of a specific example, so don't try to like,
who is it?
But just in general, like there's plenty of movies made about that, right? Like but that is an interesting thing of like, or like, or even more dramatic where you realize like, hey, I need to cut this person out of my life because this is like, resistance can also be something like loyalty, right? Like you feel loyal to somebody that maybe you shouldn't, but that's really interesting to sort of like the way that you're describing the art making process is very much like that. You're like, what, and that's an interesting thing to sort of chase down, because then it becomes not art as therapy, because that's can kind of be a little bit cringe, but sort of like, what am I really interested in?
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought in this, Freudian definition of the artist. There's this essay, or a series of essays. The first one is called The Studio Visit, and I'm blanking on the name of the critic, but she's also a painter. And she identifies as like a Freudian art critic. And I remember she says a lot of the same things in terms of like signs of maturity as an artist and the like certain attitudes towards object making and meaning making and all these things. And I remember when I first read the essay a few years ago, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's not me. I don't fit that definition, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not so much in a back and forth with it anymore because I realize we are often encouraged to pathologize ourselves. Mm-hmm. And psychoanalysis, though it's been very educational, is like one of those areas where it's like this discourse has given me a lot of tools, but it's also encouraging me to feel like there's always something wrong with me. Yeah. Which, I mean, as a person in this body, like, do I need that? No.
You're not even Catholic.
Listen, but that's the thing is like, you don't even have to be a member of a church.
No, I'm joking because that's our stereotype.
Sure, but that's the thing is like institutions can really fuck you up. Doesn't matter which ones they are. But all that's to say, like this thing about like being in therapy and like sitting with a thing and looking at it. Yeah, there is so much there, and I think I used to feel a lot of shame about like having this level of self-reflection in my practice, but I'm like, no, that's what it is. Like grappling with this vexation in terms of like, well, I think I want to be this, but I'm actually doing this. And it's like, well, what if you just honor who you are?
Yeah.
What a concept.
Yeah. No, that's that. And especially as an artist, like I think when you go through an art education, especially the way that it's set up nowadays, maybe not so much in like the Renaissance time when it was like more about technical skills, but, we're in a space where like, especially art education in general is very not informed by art market tendencies, right? So like a lot of people are going to school to become artists, right? Or professional artists and whatnot. But then there's this like, and I'm not saying that following the market is necessarily a good or bad thing, but it is probably what most people going into art school think that they're going to learn to do. Yeah. Whereas a lot of people leave art school not being able to make art because the critical discourse has become so, and I'm talking specifically from the experience, but I also know from doing the show that a lot of people experience this, but like just it becomes a set of rules. Like even the example that I was giving you is like, you don't put an object directly in the middle of the page, you know, like these things that I think you're taught to think of as amateurish, but then it's also stylistic, you know, like there is a whole branch of photography of people that emulate, there's Nikki something. She's the one that does she has a very Cindy Sherman practice. It's a woman that takes photographs of herself, but to make those pictures so effective, they are shot with an eye of somebody that is like just kind of taking instamatic shots of themselves, right? Yeah. And that's what makes them so powerful because they sell you with that aesthetic of like, oh, I'm not a fine art photographer. I'm not I'm not using the zone system, even though it's color, but you know, like that is a really interesting thing, right? Like, a lot of these things can become incredibly restrictive, right? And like honestly, for a long time, I mean, it took me like, I graduated in 2007 and it wasn't until 2012 that I started making the pieces that I had been conceiving into like 4 years earlier and had just kind of dropped off because I was like too critical of it. It was, and then I was listening to people that weren't artists telling me like, that's not necessarily going to work because it was all contraption, it's like it's appropriating, something that does something, but to do something else and things like that. But it really is an interesting thing. How much capitalism do you feel plays into that? And that's a leading question because I feel like it does, but I feel like there is a very close, like I feel like my Catholic guilt as I've grown older is directly tied to my productivity. Yeah. And anyway, if you want to speak on that.
Well, this is something I have been learning about in the past few years, but when I met Wyatt Coday, who is, they have a practice that's called Nor Research Studio. that talks a lot about artists' relationships to money and how that affects what their practice is and all these things. And one of the things that they've really highlighted for me is that depending on your class position or your sort of like class experience, you learn to internalize certain attachments or relationships to these institutions, right? So often, and I mean, I think about this with my own college experience and thinking about it. So I went to Princeton in undergrad.
Oh, you have like great credentials, man. I wish I had known.
She's a schoolgirl, honey. She's a schoolgirl. But I don't come from a family that has a lot of money. Like I got hella financial aid and it was wonderful. But as I've thought about that process, I've realized like there is this attitude, and people even say this like, oh, like, on one hand, oh, you're such a great student. You deserve to be here because you worked hard and you earned this and you deserved it. But there's also this flip side of like, and you should be grateful that you're here.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas if you're someone who is born into the social circles where it's expected that you'll go to Princeton because you went to this prep school,
or because your parents were someone with somebody.
Exactly. Right. There is no well, there may be feelings of guilt, but generally there is no feeling of guilt because it's like expected that you'll walk into this thing. And I think it's very similar with arts institutions and higher education institutions. Like a lot of these institutions somehow transmit the idea that if your interests are not being represented and embodied and enacted, then it's a favor that you're here. So I know for myself and with people that I've talked to, if they do leave a school environment, it's sort of like, well, why did I spend so much time internalizing these discourses that don't actually reflect what my interests are as a maker? And I think there can be a lot of resentment that builds up. And it's taken me a long time to realize these things are tools for me now. Like I'm not enthralled to them because newsflash, it doesn't matter how many degrees I have or how much exposure I have. I will never be a part of, these groups of people who are making decisions in certain ways or that are prominent in certain ways. It's like that.
Sorry, go ahead.
That knowledge is now just a tool for me to use how I see fit. And I think the only way I've gotten to that point is by being in community with people who are like, yeah, honey, like you're a Black person, you're a queer Black person. Like it was never going to work out for you. By design.
And what I was going to say when I almost interrupted you, or when I had to hold myself back from interrupting you, was that like, even if you do get into those places, you have to sacrifice a lot, right? Because those spaces, like you can't, there's not a lot of room for individuality and self-expression in those higher 1% communities, right? Like I don't really think that there is. I mean, it's probably considered maybe quaint and stuff like that, right? As opposed to like actually meaningful the way that it does to you. And I think like, I mean, that's the whole selling out thing, right? Like I think if you work for MSNBC, first of all, you probably have always been programmed. That's the whole Noam Chomsky thing. Like you have this job because you've been groomed since you were a child. And if you do not conform to those things, so even if you wanted to, right? And I think that that's a lot of what the DEI stuff that's happening right now is. It's not, let's make this a generally more equitable society. Let's make it more inclusive. But to get into those upper echelons of social strata, you kind of have to conform to certain things, right? I'm not saying you got to go to Epstein Island, although I'm not saying it, but I'm also not saying it. You know what I mean? Like there's like, it just gets weird when you get up into those areas.
Yeah, and I should say I don't want to act like, oh, I'm an outsider artist, but I'm like clearly that's not true. But I think for a lot of the people who I'm in creative community with and other kinds of community as well, I think a lot of folks are reckoning with this I keep using this word vexed, but this vexed history of like, they may be marginalized people who come from marginalized situations, some of which are really gnarly. And the promise of a better life or whatever might be held out by a lot of these institutions. And so it makes sense why we go to them. And I know for myself, like moving throughout that process, it has been this sort of like dual awareness. Du Bois talks about double consciousness. It's not quite that, but it's related. This thing of like, I'm a good student. I really enjoy reading theory. I think I'm rare in that sense. I really enjoy reading theory. I know that I'm accomplished at these things within the classroom. And yet, like you say, it seems a lot of the stuff that I'm doing does feel quaint.
Within that context. Yeah.
Yes. But I think, especially now, and I think this David Hammond's project, The Sign, is like such a great example, this stupidly obvious thing. I'm like, but that's actually what I'm good at.
Yeah. That's, by the way, as a conceptual artist, I respect how conceptual that piece is. I also, like I hate to repeat things that I've been. I read a book that was really impactful about postmodernism, and one of the things that intrinsically within these institutions, they become conceptual, they become theoretical almost exclusively, and there's no room, like, a lot of people in institutions, like teaching institutions, are very outspoken politically and about certain things. But a lot of times when they see people protesting on the streets or activists, there is a clear separation between them, and then they get critical of it. Right. But they ain't doing shit, So you are in this place where you're safe and you can be critical. And I feel like a lot of times that criticality comes from that sense of like, I'm so far removed from this. Sure. Like you're not necessarily, it's like when you're a temp at an office and you try to work really hard to get hired, and the other people are like, you're making us look bad.
Sure. Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. There's like a strong resistance and resentment towards, all these like people that are actually doing the actual work of showing up, doing mutual aid, doing things like that are really what on a direct level physically changes the lives of people. And while they can just act highfalutin and have these really, intellectual ideas that ultimately, when you take them, one of the things that that book, it's called Fashionable Nonsense, and it's two physicists that completely destroy French postmodernism. It's such an interesting read, because like you read it and they are excerpts from the postmodernists, and it's just so dense and impenetrable, and you can't fucking understand it because they're using all this language and I feel like that is the institutional element, right? Like where what the case that they make is that especially leftist movements, right-wing movements have always had more of a flexibility within that postmodern space. Left-wing movements have always been more rationalist, and just straight up, it starts with the French Revolution, right? Which is like the first, like, off with our heads kind of thing, right? And so that comes out, that mentality, that rationality comes out of the Enlightenment, right? Yeah, whereas not that spirituality, or not that religion is postmodern, but it can be, right? Like in this really interesting way. So for me, that's just fascinating, like, and yeah, that's I chose not to go to grad school because I was just like, and I don't begrudge any. Look, dude, if I got into fucking UCLA, I would have gone,
But also, if you don't need to, don't go.
No, yeah. I mean, I do this instead, but and it's a much longer route. It's more like getting a doctorate than getting a.
You're in it for the long haul.
Yeah, it's a commitment, But yeah, I find that really interesting. That duality that I can only imagine what the experience must have been like for you, to just be in these institutions, sort of, hear people that are essentially full of shit. Like there is a lot of that, right? There is a lot of people that say things that are fashionable ideas, but when you actually go to applying them in a practical sense, like, you know, like a lot of people are like, yeah, let's be communists. Okay. All right. Give me your iPhone.
Yeah. Well, you know, what's funny is, I said the thing about like God can use anybody.
Yeah.
When I was in grad school, like one of the areas that, I spent a lot of time reading in was this field that's known as Black Studies. And it can mean a lot of different things, but a lot of the writing in that field has actually gotten pretty popular in the last few years. So if you've heard about Christina Sharp or Saidiya Hartman, like these sort of like superstar academics.
Would you put bell hooks in that category or no? I only bring her up because you said fashionable.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yes and no, but that's a different conversation.
We don't have to, we can stick to what you were talking about.
Sure. But the thing is about Black studies, often people will look at some of the writing and be like, oh my gosh, like I can't understand it. It's so dense and blah, 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 blah. And one of the reasons I loved it, or still love Black studies, or at least appreciate it, is a lot of these folks are drawing on like these super dense French authors like Derrida and Foucault and all these people. Yeah. And
I just after reading that book, Foucault is full of shit.
Well, but this is the thing. This is the thing for me is like when I think about like Black scholars in particular, like, yes, obviously, like a lot of Black scholars, like a lot of scholars, period. If you have tenure, it's very easy to say blah, 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 blah. And then at the end of the day, something different happens. But learning the history of how we got to this place. Yeah. I think about someone like, why am I blanking on her name? Hortense Spillers wrote this essay called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe back in the 80s. And what's so amazing about this essay, she's like, she says something like, my country needs me, and if I didn't exist, they would have to invent me, something like this. She's trying to find a language for describing Black women's experience in the United States, especially in the afterlife or afterlives of enslavement. And she's like, literally nobody was writing about this. So I had to use whatever tools I had to come up with a language to explain this experience. Yeah. And I think that a lot of these French dudes, like nobody's required to like them, but I think I appreciate them so much because they are asking this question of like, what actually is writing? Yeah. Like, how do we make sense of things? And so what's great about all of these things is like, I see authors who are like, I can appreciate this thing for what it is. And then also when I don't need it, I can put it down. So I think for me, I think the thing that's helped me like make peace with a lot of this stuff is like honestly lowering my expectations, not expecting institutions to like act on the behalf of the people because that's not what they're meant to do. Yeah. But to be like, yeah, theory can be great, and also like when it's time to put it down, just put it down. It's not about the institution. It's about what is useful to me. And
just to go back and make a correction. I think he's full of shit. That doesn't mean that he's not right about some things. I think so. Like the conceit of the book is basically that science is based on empirical study, right? Like you can do an experiment, recreate it, and all of that, like empirical. And then what the French intellectuals of that time at like the 70s, 60s, and 70s, what they were doing was elevating themselves through this theoretical thing where they were elevating the humanities to the same level of elite, you know, because if in the atomic era, in the atomic era, there were, you know, everybody was blowing Oppenheimer and all these people, like science was like, you know, better living through chemistry, all of that shit. That was like the main cultural push of the 50s and 60s, right? And so you get into this place where the humanities are maybe left a little behind. So what they start doing is they start writing using the language of science, which is very dense and impenetrable, and hiding the fact and obscuring what they're actually saying within this language. Foucault, I will say this, there is something to moral relativism. I do understand the value of that, and I do understand on an individual level, but on a societal level, it's the Enlightenment, man. You know,
I think you're actually right on some level. Like, in terms of like Enlightenment thinking continuing, like, yes, absolutely. I think a lot of people, including people I really admire, are sort of like, we're doing something new. And it's like, well, no, I think you might still be enforcing this body-mind split. What I'll say about the humanities thing, and this is, I remember, oh my gosh, in college, I used to love arguing with one of my friends about this because he was an engineer who later became a professor in religious studies. So there you go. But what I will say, I won't get into this whole thing because I have so many ideas about it. I think, yes, that is true, this sort of jargonizing thing, especially when things come to America in the 80s and 90s. I think
for sure
that's a thing. But I also when people say things like this,
like what?
This sort of like, well, this humanities high theory jargon, blah, 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 is bullshit. I'm like, well, nobody reads a chemistry paper and expects to understand it. Like,
chemists do.
Right. But I think there's this idea that like the humanities is sort of like an open space where there's like nothing deeper to understand. And I know that's not what you're saying, right? Okay. But I think often people have this response of like, what does it mean for me to like read something in the humanities and not understand it? I should be able to understand it. And it's like, on some level, yes. When it comes to practical applications, yes. If it's not giving you shit, then it's not useful. At the same time, I think when these authors are at their best, and they don't really need my defense, but what I draw from them is like, they're creating language because that's actually necessary to creating a different kind of world. I think that's one reason I continue to return to theory, whether it's the French people or not. I don't really read them that much, but I remain invested in theory because
I'm not trashing all of theory.
Sure, I know.
I'm saying specifically the postmodern movement was very interesting because they were applying topology, mathematical frameworks.
Yes, I think that's great.
Yeah, but when you sit and read a book written by a physicist who knows what the words, who actually knows how to read physics books. So,
I see. Oh, they always say this though. They're like, we're not trying to be scientists. We're invested in metaphor and discourse.
Do you know who Alan Sokol is? He's the guy that wrote the book.
I'm not super familiar, but I know his name.
The hoax, the Sokol hoax. Yeah, that's pretty brazen, right? Like if someone can come and write a bullshit, if a physicist can come and write a completely bullshit article and get it published, at some point the practicality of that kind of writing comes into question, I would say.
But I would say, I mean, first of all, like, the 90s.
This is fun, by the way.
I know, I love it. I haven't had a conversation like this in so long. I'm very into it. But it's like in the 90s, like people were, I think there's a lot of ski trip stuff that happened around a lot of scholarship.
What do you mean ski trip?
I think people were high on coke when they were running along. But I say all that to say, like, what's interesting about this Sokol affair is that that's an institutional problem, not so much a scholarly one. I mean, I see what you mean.
Yeah, I would say
I see what you mean.
I would say that when you read things, and to be fair, I don't necessarily understand the excerpts until they're explained to me, and so he could just be making all of this shit up. But I think that there is something to the, like, you reference tenure, right? And how when you have, like, those aren't life experiences that you're having necessarily the same way it removes you from, like, to be a leftist that is a postmodernist in academia is a non-starter for me, right? Like you can be a historian, you can be a humanitarian, you can be a secular humanist and all of that, but if you need, like, one of my favorite things is this, to say to people is this, like, nowadays everybody wants to know from an expert, right? Like I'm not going to listen to that opinion, especially like in the Democratic Party. There's a lot of that is like, we need to trust the experts. That's why we have experts that on how to censor properly misinformation and all of that. Now, if you only leave it up to the people, if the only valid opinions in the world are those of the educated people, then the only valid opinions are those of the people who have access to that education, right? And you're completely discrediting the life experience of people that don't have access to that or chose not to, right? Like, so it's this, my hesitation with the postmodern thing, and I love postmodernism. It's so much fun. It's like, but it's like, it is just mental masturbation.
A lot of times,
a lot of times it is.
This is a tangent, but it's related to what we're talking about. It's a tangent, but it's related. Do you know about Project 2025?
I think I've heard of that. There's so many things called Project something though. So go ahead.
But Project 2025, I try to let people know about this as often as I can, is an initiative that's being funded by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. And there are 4 aspects of the program, but the main goal is for conservatives to find someone who can be their ideal presidential candidate and hand them this manual that they've been working on for 40 years and be like, this is your policy platform.
Yeah.
What is so wild to me about this is not that, oh my gosh, it's conservatives, but that over 40 years, the Heritage Foundation has managed to marshal like 400 or 500 conservative voices to come together and collaborate on this policy platform. And I think we mentioned this a few minutes ago, but to me, like I understand why there's so much fragmentation on the left, which is a term that every time I use it, I'm just like, it's not even useful.
Yeah, it's an antiquated term for sure.
Yes, but people talk about leftism sort of being like the home of organizing and activism, but honestly, to me, like conservatives in the United States have figured out way more in terms of how to do this. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they have the resources that allow these things to happen, that allow disagreement to be supported. But I think what's especially important in this case is that conservatives understand the value of telling a story that somehow sets out a cosmology. And I think that among avowed leftists, the ability to find not even a coherent story, but to be able to formulate stories, whether they're provisional or longer term stories, to find points of commonality and to build discourse around those things. I think that's a skill that's so fraught yet so important. So I think when you talk about like the postmodern thing, it's like that work to me is often, like you say, it's not connected to a broader network of experience. And I think at this point, I'm most interested in conversations and stories that are helping people learn how to relate more consciously to themselves, to each other, and to other beings that support our lives. I think for me, that's what I want from any sort of like theory or practice, is like, how are you helping me understand like who and what is around me, how I'm part of something. Yeah. And I think unfortunately that's one thing that Project 2025 is really good at. Yeah.
Well, I would also say that there is no such thing as a party that's not conservative within this country. Yeah, sure. Because we really are dealing with like neoliberalism, which is Reaganism. Like the what people that really like Hillary Clinton don't realize is that she's a Reaganite. Essentially her policies are completely indistinguishable in many ways. Maybe she likes gay people, although only after a certain date, Sure. But it's, and I think that I think that kind of speaks to more of what I'm saying in terms of like, I think, there is definitely something to be said for postmodernism in terms of magical thinking for yourself, right? Like I have to have the delusion that this podcast is going to succeed and become profitable at some point. Otherwise I wouldn't do it, right? Like for my mind, postmodernism can be helpful.
Yes.
But in terms of actually helping people, then you end up in a situation where, we don't have to like pick on any particular politician, but who's a hero?
Sure. But I think that's, I think that is the importance of being a cultural worker, though. Like I obviously hear all the time, like theory, it's not good for anything. Well, it's like, well, if you're a person who is helping make culture, then if you're going to be immersed in that work, hopefully it's helpful to you. I think I value theory because it's like a blueprint for like what can be possible. And so I look at it and then I'm like, well, I don't need anyone to go read this stuff. But for me, I'm going to read this to ask myself, well, then how do I want my practice to sort of like open up these other possibilities for being with people?
No, for sure. I think that just my hesitancy is that on an institutional sense, right? Postmodernism is something that can be aggressively weaponized.
Oh, of course.
And that is unfortunately the reality that happens a lot of times. And we're speaking specifically about one kind of theory, right? Because there's all different kinds of theory and all different kinds of philosophy. I'm not disparaging everything in general. I'm just specifically interested in the detachment that comes from that, right? Like the detachment that comes from being protected by an institution, right? Until you're not, until you say something and then you're out, right? But it's really like that's kind of the crux of it for me. Like it's not like there is, I love the Matrix movies. That shit's all Foucault, like it's there is some validity to the philosophy. My concern with it as an institutional dogmatic approach is that it ends up being weaponized in the same way that religion does. Right. Even the concept of anti-racism, right? Like there are a lot of really racist people that claim to be anti-racist.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it's something that it's like a branding exercise, right? And probably the healthier way to deal with racism is to be like, yeah, sometimes I think fucked up things, and spot those and address them. Kind of like what we were talking about. Where's that resistance? Yeah. Why am I resistance to people of this culture? Oh, well, there was this one experience I had and I've colored everything with that experience, right? Or I'm from Florida. I was around people that used to say a lot of fucked up things and I've internalized them somehow. That's where it comes, like the idea that no one's born racist, right? Sure. Although that's a little iffy though for me though, because like sometimes like I don't know.
think people are very strongly encouraged to participate in racism.
Yeah, yes. But I also think that there is something to the differences between people that even if you don't learn racism, you might come up with like assumptions, like uninformed things, right? And that is racism, right? Essentially. But yeah, anyway, that's basically the point. Like the point, like for me, anti-racism is a very postmodern ideological bent where it's gotten to the point where people are like terrified of acknowledging that they have any bent of prejudice, and then like, how is that going to resolve anything?
I'm trying to find like a way to sort of like
to shut me down.
No. Well, if that happens, then no. But I'll say like as we're having this conversation, I just keep thinking of this phrase, chew the meat and spit the bones.
I've never heard that. What is that?
Well,
is that a South Carolina colloquialism?
I forget where I heard it, but it's this idea of like, I think
take what you want and then, okay.
Yes. And I think it goes beyond that, right? It goes beyond like, take what you need and leave the rest, because that feels very individualistic. And I think to the point of anti-racism as you're describing it. A lot of these things, like you say, they're so easily weaponized because they're stories that are told from almost no perspective. It's like, well, you need to stop being racist. How is anyone supposed to do that?
Yeah.
Like, practically speaking,
it's like not being a sinner to some degree, right? Those parallels there are
well, but it's not because people are innately racist. It's because we live in a society that attaches actual material benefits to being racist.
Yeah.
So like, if we're going to do this thing of like, well, another world is possible, we can get rid of racism, sexism, homophobia, queerphobia, transphobia. It's like, are people just supposed to figure that out as free market individuals contained in their own bubbles? It's like, no, we have to build communities of thought and action. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the reasons I've enjoyed working this way. Like I talked about this piece, Trouble, like starting with the questions, starting with the stories, starting with the anecdotes. I find so often in performance settings, people get called together and it's like, well, then what are we actually doing? We say that this is supposed to be like X, Y, and Z sort of piece, but like what's actually happening? And I feel like in the 10 years I've been doing dance in LA, this happens so much. I was actually at a book launch event earlier this week for this amazing book called Being Work, edited by Dorothy Dubrul, published by Insert Press, just came out. Mm-hmm. And some of those questions are like part of the book is like, well, what are we supposed to do as performers if we know the economy of performance is so fucked in a lot of ways? And we can ask these questions all day, but the questions, they need to be like a tree. They have roots that spread and they grow up and have branches that spread. Mm-hmm. I think trying to figure all of these things out in our own hearts and minds, talk about Foucault and discipline. It's like trying to figure out all these things in our own hearts and minds. Like that is the perfect capitalist operation. We have to be in community with people, or at least in connection with people where we're like, we're coming together in order to work on 1, 2, and 3. How are we going to do that? I think being that intentional sort of like saves us from this like hellishly punishing abstraction of capitalist life. It doesn't matter if you're Donald Trump or Foucault being taught in a university. As long as we receive these things as isolated individuals, the weaponization will continue. But I think if we're grounded in a sense of belonging that reveres all the parts of ourselves, all the parts of other people, like the earth, all these things that we say aren't alive. We talked about this Alaska thing earlier. I think this is an excellent place where it comes in. It's like you remember that ideas, stories, words, all these things, they can come from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the kind of work that's the most life-giving. Honestly, that's why spirituality is such a big part of my work, because we can talk ourselves to death. But if these things are rooted in something that gives us life, then it's like, okay, then we're doing something.
I was just in Miami and it was, I hadn't been there in 15 years and it was super refreshing because as a Latino out in LA, there's a context here. When I go over there, like, my feeling of how anti-racism, like this is, I would say people are openly racist in Florida.
Sure.
And people are, and people are openly anti-racist here. Right. Well, they purport to be.
Sure. Yes.
Right. And so one of the things that was mind blowing is even within that framework, Latinos in Miami see themselves as in a different light than Mexicans and more indigenous cultures out here in LA. And that is something that even white people absorb. So like a white person that goes to Miami, you can't condescend. You're not going to be able to, because it's just not in the mental reality. Right. And we can get into the details as to why. There was huge white flight in Miami when my parents got to the U.S. They all left to the rest of the state. Everybody's in Fort Lauderdale. Broward County blew up as a result of that, right? And a lot of them were white. There's a lot of white Cubans that came. And so to me, that's the interesting thing, where it's like when you come over here, there's this absolute denial of racism, of the possibility that I could be racist. Like being called a racist is possibly the biggest insult you could give a white person out here.
Sure.
You can't even hold someone to account because the defensiveness gets out there. Whereas in Florida, people are like, yeah, I'm racist, whatever. And like, okay, I know not to hang out with you.
Right.
But over here, I don't know who not to hang out with because because a lot of the people that purport to not be racist, they drop some shit and you're like, oh, fuck, I thought you were anti-racist. So I agree with what you're saying. I totally agree with your perspective. And I think that something like the term anti-racist, or here's the other one that I hate, punching Nazis. What's that going to resolve? Are you like the idea that like you get to be violent because people are vile, you know?
So what I'll say about that is...
Well, let me just complete the thought before, because I don't want to get misinterpreted. But I'm saying like, if you go and you assault, like there's that musician that gets all the KKK guys, Daryl, whatever his name is. He befriends Grand Dragons until they give him his their whatever uniform or their shit, and he has a collection of them. And who is this? Daryl something. He's there's a documentary on him. He's an old musician. I think he's a guitarist. And so he goes and he like just goes straight up to them, becomes friends, and then eventually over the years through a friendship, they start to relinquish all those things. Do I think that's more effective than punching a Nazi? I think so. If the Nazis are killing people, that is a different story, right? Like they're breaking the law. You arrest them, you fucking put them in jail and shit like that. I'm totally fine with that. But just because someone has vile opinions to make it okay to like be violent with them, I think kind of misses the point. And what I feel like that punching Nazis attitude does is it doesn't accept the context of it. It's just, you're completely wrong. Racism doesn't come in a vacuum. That person wasn't born racist, you know? Does that make sense? Yes. And I mean, there are many things I could say. I think. Go ahead. I'm not afraid. Yeah, sometimes I can be wrong. There are very good reasons to punch Nazis, but I think the thing that's most important to me in this moment, and I really started thinking about this with, I mean, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, but also with Aaron Bushnell, if you heard about him. The thing that was really striking to me about the Aaron Bushnell situation was seeing how many people were describing him as a hero and as a martyr, and as someone who's like a righteous example of what it means to divest from genocide. And I'm like, I get that for him. Mm-hmm. I think for me, a lot of issues in the past few years, but particularly the ongoing situation in Gaza for me has really shown me that events in and of themselves feel less important to me in this context, feel less important than their mediation. Mm-hmm. I think that so much of what counts as politics in this country is actually like people working out various relationships to mediation. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about Nazis or black people or Gaza or whatever, often we're talking about abstractions. Yes. Which are very real and they have material impacts on people's lives. But I wonder whether we have the skills to distinguish a mediation from a different kind of experience. No. And I think that's another thing that I'm really invested in my practice is like when I talked about this performance trouble and what it means for performers to do something on behalf of an audience. It's like, what does it mean for an individual to take on some larger or more abstract function? Do we know how that move actually happens? Mm-hmm. So I like I said, I think there are sometimes some very good reasons to punch Nazis and and sometimes not. But do we have the skills to even begin asking what those criteria
might be. I don't think we do.
Well, I mean, we have been giving weapons to Nazis, like in Ukraine, right? So
Well, who do you think is a Nazi in Ukraine?
The Azovs and all of that, the C-14, all of, like.
I'm not. I will say I'm not very well versed about what's happening in Ukraine. So.
We're also treading on dangerous ground for YouTube, so we can just speak more broadly. But my point is not that Nazis don't deserve to be punched. Mm-hmm. I tie it into sort of that. Like who decide, like it's also like labels like terrorists and whatnot. Who decides who is a terrorist? Who decides who is a Nazi, right? People that tattoo themselves with fucking Nazi insignia, I think is pretty fair. But then we have this whole media apparatus. It's like, they're not really Nazis, you know? And like, so then where do those people that identify as Nazi punchers, where do they, how do they navigate that? Right. Like, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, like, for a better example, I think there's a lot of Antifa that don't realize that they engage in fascist tactics. Right. Uh-huh. And so I understand, yes, Nazis are bad. And yes, on a visceral level, it feels good to be like, yeah, let's fucking punch the Nazis, right? Sure. If I'm at a punk show and a Nazi punk gets in my face, I might punch them. Mm-hmm. But as a policy, as a general policy of like there is a dehumanizing element there that I don't necessarily think is that productive. Because and I'll go even more extreme. I think that there, like, we dehumanize serial killers, right? Mm-hmm. And we're like, that's inhuman. But that is a human with a dysfunctional brain, right? And, like,
go ahead.
There's whatever, there's something they lack empathy or whatever, but that is a human being. When they get a head injury or whatever, they lack that empathy. There a lot of people that are sociopaths run our country. They're not murderers, but they have the same fucking level of empathy as maybe like a Ted Bundy, right? And so if you go around and you're like, these people are not human, then you lose some understanding of what encompasses human, as opposed to, you narrow it down to this saintly, like, in the image of God thing that I have a problem with.
Well, and maybe this will be, I guess, into the end. But again, I think this is one reason I think spiritual practice is so important. Mm-hmm. And also, I don't think I've talked about this, but one reason I think this whole category of like the human and humanity and empathy and all these things, I'm very skeptical of them because I agree. I think often there's this thing of like, well, who deserves to live and who deserves to die? Like, that's honestly so much of the work that this idea of humanity and the human does, is like trying to figure out, well, who's good to live and who should be killed. When I think about Afro-diasporic spiritual belief systems, and this really took me a long time, but the concept of justice, like, it has nothing to do with who's good and who's not. Like, anybody can get these hands, honestly. Like, even if you think you're the most saintly person ever, like, someone can decide to take you out and it can be totally justified. I say that because I didn't get into this whole thing about cultural somatics, which is a whole other discourse. But one of the things that discourse talks about is what if we could understand things like violence as like spiritual entities? You talked about people in Antifa like often engaging fascist tactics. I don't know details about that, but it's like all of these violences overtake us. They're taught to us. I think if we were minding our business in a world that didn't operate on oppression, we wouldn't have any reason to ask, like, well, how do we deal with serial killers? Serial killers, part of why they exist, first of all, is because we live in all these systems that, yes, they put serious mental strain on people. I don't even want to associate serial killers with pathology, because I think that happens all the time. And there are so many behaviors that quote unquote normal people engage in that are so pathological, if you want to go there. But I think the thing for me, all of this is to say, and I said this on Instagram concerning Aaron Bushnell, is like, I think so often we're encouraged to think about politics as things that are happening out there. Like, how do we respond to Nazis or not? How do we respond to these people or not? I and the people I'm in community with encourage people to consider how the people we see in the world actually live in us. I may not be a serial killer, but like, do I engage in behaviors that manipulate people to doing things that I want them to do? Yes. I'm incentivized to think that way because look at the world we live in. I think the more I've been able to do that, and the more that I like listen to people in disability justice and transformative justice talk about similar things, they're like, yeah, part of holding space for people is realizing that you could do the exact same thing. It doesn't mean it's okay, and there may be consequences, but it's like, actually, there's so much work to do if you like start with this. Even the thing about serial killers, which I'm not saying you said this, but when I think about why serial killers are such a prominent topic of discussion now, when I think about the role that true crime plays in our culture generally, it's like, why are we so worried about other people's violences? We're living through our own every day when we go to work, even if it's a job that you like, right? In our intimate relationships, like these things are all marked by violence. And I think trying to escape that violence, talk about Christian ideas. That's a Christian idea. Like, what does it mean to hold that violence with grace and yet be like, because I see it with grace, I'm not going to allow it to happen. I think there has to be like I keep using this word vexed, but like not trying to separate ourselves from these things, but rather like, how can we get to a place where we realize that all the shit we see in the world, we're capable of it too. And it happens through us.
Yeah. I think just to go back to clarify for my own sake so that I don't get canceled. The Nazi punching thing, to me, I just want to be clear that it's a virtue. It's a non-thought out virtue signal. And
yes,
because
virtues, very Christian thinking. Yes.
And if you really look at the history, after World War II, Germany was not denazified. Nazis were made illegal, but everybody was a Nazi. They didn't have anybody to run the government. They didn't have anything, right? So we didn't get to the moon without Nazis. Are you going to punch Werner von Braun? Like, I think he deserves a punch. I'm not saying he doesn't. I don't think he should have. But my point is that is the moral relativism that postmodernism has introduced, right? I think the sentiment was, well, we got to get these guys or the Russians will, right? We got to bring them in here or the Russians will, right? So the world is not as idealistic as punch Nazis, you know, and the world is not as simplistic as I'm against racism and that's going to fix racism, you know, and to me, those are very, very much branch out of a postmodern dogma of we don't really have to do anything if we say the right things. We don't really have to denazify Germany after the war, as long as we say Nazis are bad. You know, like, what are you going to do? What is the proper solution? We wipe out all of Germany after the war. There's a whole argument made that we bombed Dresden and we were fucking brutal to those people, right? Like in a way that isn't considered fair. That's Nazi punching, you know? So then like, my issue with Nazi punching is that I don't think that you shouldn't punch Nazis. I think that there is very much an avenue and an opportunity where that makes perfect sense, right? But you know, but it's a simplistic way. It's a simplistic worldview that really doesn't give room for a discussion about what the world is actually like. And that's where you get to fix the things, right? Like you were saying, you can have a discussion about how to affect change. And there are things that people put out, which I think you've already done plenty, given plenty of examples. I think that certain things like those little things like anti-racism and all of that, I think they're just to make you feel better.
Well, this
just
is
to make the individual feel better and righteous. You know, it's like it's self-righteousness.
They can be.
Yeah.
And they often are.
Yeah.
I think that's why chewing the meat and spitting the bones is important.
Yes, yes.
Because again, like when it comes to thinking about Black experience, like being willing to punch someone in the face is often the only way you're going to be able to make it out of the situation alive.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I think that's true for a lot of marginalized people. I think that's one of the great affordances of performances. Like we can have theoretical discussions all day, but like in the moment, right? When I told the story about like the old man's behind me, what am I going to do?
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes you need to punch the Nazi.
Yeah. No. I'm not against punching Nazis.
Sure.
I'm against the saying Nazi puncher.
I think this is one of the reasons it's so important to imagine different ways of being together.
Yes.
Because Nazism is an evil born of capitalism, and punching Nazis is an annoyance that is also born of capitalism. I think punching Nazis can be useful and often is, but if I chew the meat of that and say like sometimes I'm going to need to punch a Nazi and spit the bones, it's like, well, then I don't need to be worrying about being virtuous. I just need to do what is life-giving to me in this situation. And it's not, I don't think, simply a thing of like, well, it's good to me, so I'm going to do it. Hopefully people are making these decisions in community with other folks who are actually holding them accountable and saying like, why would it be important for us to be able to act or to be able to punch a Nazi, for instance? Why is that a life-giving thing? I think those are the kind of conversations I want to hear more. I think, like you say, often people are interested in virtue, which again, it's like such a Christian, like an oppressively Christian idea. Rather than talking about virtue, what about like, when is it life-giving to kick someone's ass and why? Yeah. When is it life-giving to have a conversation and why? As opposed to giving all of these power to symbols and words. Like, what is the life-givingness of the actions we take?
It's just not brave, you know, to take an anti-Nazi stance is just like, it's so blasé.
But I don't try to be agnostic about things because that's not possible for me. But what I will say is like, everything is, there's a Bible verse that says everything is useful, but not for me. Yeah. Saying punch Nazis can be virtue signaling. It can also be life-saving.
Yeah, but you know, but if you're saying it and not doing it, I think it's a virtue signal.
It depends. It depends on the experience that brings a person to that moment.
I don't know. We can just disagree on it. I mean, I'm okay with it. I just think it's such an easy big bad. You know, it's like saying like saying like, I fuck the devil, you know, fuck him. You know, like most people have never met a Nazi. They don't know what their ideology actually is. They've never had a conversation with an actual Nazi. I'm not saying that would change their perspective, but there is a victimization when people get caught up in ideology, just the same as there is, you know, like if you were born in Nazi Germany, does every fucking Nazi that was born with what was happening contemporarily in their society, were they all the same level of evil? Were some of them lying to themselves the same way that most, like there are very human elements in there. And I am interested in understanding and unpacking why the fuck you're a Nazi rather than just hating you because you're a Nazi. That's my only point.
Oh, great. To that I would say that's some people's work, but it's not mine.
No. Yeah. No, I'm not invested.
Yeah.
Nazis is just the easiest target, you know, like racists also. also, it's like, yeah, there are people that are racist, but they're also just fucking human beings. And to the degree that they are a sin, like, to me, it becomes dogmatic, and it becomes secular dogma.
Yeah,
It's secular dogmatism, and when people are secular humanists and they think that is a virtuous thing without it having the just it being as capable of being toxic as anything else. That's when I pause.
And I mean, that point, if nothing else, above all, like, I think that is something to point to, or something to dwell with. It's like, the more we cling to these abstractions of goodness and blah, 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 we can lose sight of the fact that, again, we're capable of doing the same things. And maybe I said this, but I found for myself, the more that I do that work, it's not that I become less interested in worrying about the abstractions.
Yeah.
It's just like, I see that part of myself. I honor it in myself. And because I honor it in myself, I can't tolerate it out in the world. Yeah.
No, man. I mean, we could probably keep going for 3 hours.
I know.
That's why I told you, like, I gave you a heads up, because I love talking about this thing, this kind of thing. I know that you do too. I can already tell. We may have to get a beer sometime. I don't know if you drink.
I do drink beer. I love beer.
All right. Well, we might have to do that, and then just really get into it without cameras, without being worried about, getting into like the free speech jail.
You know what's so funny? I've talked to a few friends about this, and I've said, coming to LA, it's so rare that I have heated conversations with people. And I think there's some good to that, because I literally have cleared out rooms having arguments with people before. So it's nice to consider other people's experience. But I do love a good fisticuffs every now and then.
I mean, I don't think this was that. This was, it's polite disagreement happens on the show all the time. Yeah. But I don't even think we disagree. I think I maybe just wasn't explaining the thing right. I think once we got to that last way that I said it, I think you finally understood where I was coming from, which is to say, I'm all for punching Nazis, but like, I would put it to you this way: is everybody in Israel a bad person? Right now, they're carrying out something somewhat corollary to what happened with these big bad people. Am I going to go around saying that I punched Zionists? I don't know if that feels right. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, there's also a lot to say there, but what I would say is,
and we got to be careful with that one.
Sure. What I would say with the disagreement thing is, like, we agree, but we don't disagree. The French postmodernists would say, like, we're just following different discursive chains. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. And I think that is fine. But when it comes to putting the pedal, paper to the road, like a ceasefire is the most enlightenment way of approaching that is, instead of saying it's super complicated, just be like, stop bombing these people, and I think that is where the postmodernism comes in, where you're like, well, like, with the moral relativism is the thing that I struggle with.
Oh, I don't think I mentioned this. Maybe this will be the last thing I say.
Yeah, for sure.
I think one thing that's helped me with questions like this is thinking about circles of experience. Often, I think when we talk about these things like Gaza, or really anything else, there's this big picture understanding of, like, what do we do? And it's like, well, what do you do with yourself? Yeah. What do you do with your family members? What do you do with your friends? What do you do with your colleagues? What do you do with your bosses? What do we do with elected officials? What do we do with people who we've never even met? And there's like different responses on all of those levels. Yeah. So when it comes to Zionists, I do not support Zionism. I don't want to make any Zionist categorically. So that's an abstraction. Categorically, I don't want to make any Zionist feel like they believe something that's worth believing, because I don't agree with that. But I know Zionists because I grew up in churches that were Zionist. Yeah. So it's like the conversation, the practice, like, we're talking about different contexts. And it's not to say it's like, oh, it's all relative, but like how you navigate within a context, it can be guided by principle and still look different depending on the context.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a little nervous about you openly saying just because of YouTube.
I do not agree. Well,
just because of YouTube. So I just want to give you a heads up that might be clipped out.
I understand. I'll say insert watermelon emoji here. That's all I have to say.
Okay.
Yes. Insert watermelon emoji here.
But this has been lovely, and I would love to do this without cameras.
Yes.
In much more detail.
I think a lot of conversations should happen away from screens. I'm just saying.
Yeah, for sure. This had a lovely time.
Yes,
definitely. I'm serious about grabbing a beer. We can hash it out in private. But what can we promote for you?
What can you promote for
Well, you've got
me?
the show. It might be coming out. This episode probably won't be coming out in time for it, but people will still know that you did it.
I will say that there are a couple of essay projects that are nearing completion. If you follow me on Instagram at Ajani, it's my name, but all the letters spelled twice, AAJJAANNII. You can keep up with me. I also have a newsletter called Artist Learner. You can subscribe to that also through my Instagram. And I make occasional, it's not super consistent, but I make occasional announcements about things that are in the works. So if you follow me on any of those outlets, you'll see what's coming up.
Wait, so that was your Instagram, the AA?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I only see your name, so I never realized how you spell it. All right, cool. And thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate the discourse. I'm just gonna give you props on that sweater. I kind of am jealous.
It's one of my favorite sweaters. I'm trying to remember where I got it, but I have to say I do love some good thrift shopping.
Yeah.
And I love a good sweater, so it's like the best of all worlds here.
Nice. Well, I mean, it looks brand new, but I believe
I take good care of it. Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, dude, this is great. Yeah. And then thank you guys for watching. We'll be back next week with another guest and another topic that may or may not get me canceled.
Listen, we should all dare to live on the edge. Where the world is asking of it. It's asking it of us, honestly.
Yeah. You heard the anxiety.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.